The observation deck of the diplomatic station hummed with the quiet efficiency that Ziril Vexathani had come to associate with interspecies cooperation. Everything calculated, measured, sterile, exactly as it should be. She adjusted the neural dampeners at her temples, the small devices that kept her Kethmori physiology in perfect emotional equilibrium, and focused her pale silver eyes on the datapad displaying her assignment parameters. Subject: Commander Kai Thorne, human military, attaché, age, 34 standard cycles, known for tactical brilliance and excessive emotional investment in mission parameters. The last notation made her narrow her eyes in confusion. How could emotional investment be anything but a liability? Her people had evolved beyond such primitive neural misfiring eons ago. The Kethmori collective operated on pure logic, perfect efficiency, calculated outcomes. It was why they were chosen as neutral observers for these crucial peace negotiations between the human coalition and the Vrex Empire. Dr. Vexathani? The voice interrupted her analysis. She looked up to see a human aide, young, nervous, exhibiting the telltale signs of elevated stress hormones. The commander is ready for the initial briefing. Fascinating. The aide's pupils were dilated, breathing slightly elevated, small tremors in the hands. All physiological responses that served no logical purpose in a safe environment. Ziril made a note in her pad and followed the aide through the station's corridors. The briefing room buzzed with activity that struck her as chaotic. Humans moved with purpose, yes, but their interactions were punctuated by unnecessary gestures, vocal inflections that conveyed information beyond mere words. Even, she observed with clinical detachment, brief physical contacts that served no apparent functional purpose. Then she saw him. Commander Kai Thorne stood at the center of it all, and Ziril's analytical mind immediately cataloged his physical parameters. Approximately 1.8 meters tall, broad shoulders suggesting optimal physical conditioning, dark hair with premature silver threading that indicated high-stress lifestyle choices. His hands moved as he spoke, another inefficient human trait. But there was something in the way he commanded attention that made her pause her note-taking. The Vrex are threatening to glass the Kepler colony if we don't withdraw our humanitarian aid ships, he was saying, his voice carrying across the room with absolute authority. That's 12,000 civilians, families, children, elderly, who've done nothing but try to rebuild after the last conflict. Sir, one of his subordinates interjected, the strategic value of Kepler is minimal. Perhaps nothing. Lieutenant Torres. Kai's response was sharp, and Ziril noticed the fascinating way his emotional state manifested physically. Straightened posture, slight flush to his skin, intensity in his gaze that made everyone in the room focus entirely on him. Those are people under our protection. We don't abandon people. How illogical. Ziril made rapid notes. The colony's strategic value was indeed minimal. She'd analyzed the same data. A purely rational decision would involve calculating acceptable losses versus resource expenditure. Yet this human was allowing emotional attachment to cloud optimal tactical thinking. The briefing continued for another hour, and Ziril found herself increasingly perplexed by the human patterns she observed. They made decisions based on concepts like loyalty and honor, intangible constructs that couldn't be quantified. When discussing casualty reports from previous engagements, she watched several humans exhibit signs of grief for individuals they'd never met. Most puzzling of all was Commander Thorne himself. Every tactical decision he made was sound. His strategic mind was clearly exceptional. Yet he consistently factored in variables that had no logical bearing on success probability. The welfare of non-combatants, the morale of troops under his war command, the long-term psychological impact on his people. After the briefing, she approached him directly. Commander Thorne, I am Ziril Vexathani, neutral observer for the Kethmori Collective. He turned to her with the same intensity she'd observed during the meeting, but something in his expression shifted, softened perhaps. Dr. Vexathani, I've read about your people's work. Your analytical capabilities are legendary. As is your tactical record, she replied, studying his face. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, stress markers, evidence of emotional strain that would have been eliminated in any rational species, though I confess, some of your strategic choices seem suboptimal. To her surprise, he smiled. The expression transformed his entire countenance, and for a moment, Zyral's clinical detachment wavered inexplicably. That's because you're measuring success differently than we do, he said. For humans, winning isn't just about achieving objectives, it's about who we are when we achieve them. The statement made no logical sense, yet something in the way he said it, the quiet conviction, the warmth in his voice, created an odd sensation in Zyral's chest. Her hand moved unconsciously to her neural dampeners, checking that they were functioning properly. I look forward to observing your methods, Commander, she said carefully, and I look forward to showing you what human fire looks like when it burns for something worth fighting for. As he walked away, Zyral remained motionless, processing an inexplicable urge to understand what he meant. For the first time in her life, pure logic felt insufficient to explain what she had witnessed. The diplomatic reception that evening would prove to be even more illuminating and far more dangerous to her carefully maintained equilibrium. The diplomatic hall erupted in chaos as Ambassador Vrextal slammed his chitinous fist against the negotiation table. The human coalition shows weakness with their bleeding hearts. The Kepler colony harbors insurgents. It must be cleansed. Zyral watched from her observation post as the temperature in the room seemed to rise several degrees, not from the environmental systems, but from the sudden shift in human behavior. Where moments before there had been careful diplomatic language, now she witnessed something far more primal. Commander Kai Thorne rose slowly from his seat, and Zyral noticed how every human in the room subtly oriented toward him. Like a pack responding to their alpha, another inefficient social structure that somehow produced remarkable unity. Ambassador, Kai's voice was dangerously quiet. Those insurgents you're referring to include a children's hospital, 3 schools, and a retirement community. Unless 6-year-olds and 70-year-old farmers have suddenly become military threats, the Vrex ambassador's mandibles clicked in agitation. Sentiment clouds your judgment, human. This is why your species will never achieve true galactic status. You allow emotion to override logic. Zyral found herself leaning forward, her analytical mind cataloging the fascinating physiological changes in the humans. Elevated heart rates, dilated pupils, unconscious formation of protective groupings. Yet beneath the emotion, she detected something else, a crystalline clarity of purpose that seemed to sharpen rather than cloud their thinking. Then let me be perfectly clear, Kai continued, stepping closer to the Vrex delegation. Any attack on Kepler will be considered an act of war against the Coalition. We will respond with overwhelming force. You would sacrifice millions for thousands? Vrextal's compound eyes glittered with what Zyral had learned to recognize as Vrex amusement. How wonderfully irrational. We would sacrifice everything, Kai said simply, rather than become the kind of people who abandon the innocent. The negotiations collapsed within the hour. Later that evening, Zyral found herself unable to process the day's events through her usual analytical frameworks. Her neural dampeners were functioning perfectly, yet she felt unsettled. Seeking the quiet of the observation deck, she was surprised to find Commander Thorne already there, staring out at the stars. Commander, she said softly, not wanting to disturb what appeared to be a moment of contemplation. He turned, and in the dim lighting of the deck she noticed details she'd missed before, the exhaustion in his eyes, the tension held in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the railing as if holding on to something vital. Dr. Vexthani, can't sleep either? I do not require as much rest as humans, she replied, then found herself adding, though I confess today's events have created processing difficulties. He smiled, that same transformative expression that had affected her so strangely before. You mean you can't figure out why we're willing to go to war over a colony that has no strategic value? Precisely. She moved, to stand beside him at the railing, maintaining proper distance while studying his profile. Your tactical assessments are consistently excellent, Your strategic mind is clearly superior, yet you make decisions that contradict optimal outcomes. Define optimal. The question caught her off guard. Maximum benefit with minimum resource expenditure, achieving objectives with the highest probability of success and lowest cost in materials and personnel. But you're missing a variable in that equation. She turned to face him fully. What variable? Kai was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made something in Zyral's chest tighten unexpectedly. Who we are when we achieve those objectives, what we become in the process. He looked at her then, and she found herself caught by the intensity in his eyes. Your people eliminated emotion to achieve perfect efficiency. But what did you lose in the process? Weakness, irrationality, wasted energy on non-productive psychological states. The words came automatically, doctrine ingrained since childhood. Or maybe, he said softly, you lost the reason to achieve anything at all. Before she could formulate a response, the station shuddered, a minor gravitational fluctuation from a passing asteroid field. The movement was slight, but Zyral's unfamiliarity with spaceborne installations made her lose her balance. Kai's hand shot out, catching her arm to steady her. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her system. Not painful, but startling in its intensity. His palm was warm against her skin, his grip firm but gentle, and for a moment she found herself acutely aware of how different his body temperature was from her own. Are you all right? His concern seemed genuine, and she realized he hadn't immediately released her. His thumb brushed against her wrist, such a small gesture, yet it created a cascade of sensations she had no framework to understand. Yes. She stepped back, but slowly, reluctant to break the contact entirely. Thank you. The moment stretched between them, filled with something Ziral couldn't name. Then Kai's expression shifted, becoming more serious. Can I ask you something, Dr. Vexthani? Of course. Your neural dampeners, they suppress all emotional response? Unconsciously, her hand moved to touch the devices at her temples. They maintain optimal psychological equilibrium. Emotion is chaotic, unpredictable, but also powerful. He moved closer, and she caught his scent, something warm and distinctly alive that made her suddenly aware of her own breathing. When I saw those casualty reports today, when I thought about families being separated, children being afraid, that didn't make me weak. It made me stronger. How can distress create strength? Because it reminded me what I'm fighting for. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Why do you burn so hot, human? That's what you really want to ask, isn't it? She stared at him, startled by his perceptiveness. Yes, she admitted. Kai stepped closer still, and Ziral found herself frozen by the proximity. She could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint scar along his jawline, the way his pulse beat in his throat. Because the things worth living for, he said, his voice rough with emotion, are worth feeling for. The words hit her like a physical force. Something in her chest cracked, not painfully, but like ice beginning to thaw. For a moment, her neural dampeners seemed inadequate against the surge of something that his words had triggered. I don't understand, she whispered. Maybe, he said, reaching up to touch her face with gentle fingers. Understanding isn't the point. Maybe feeling is. When he finally pulled away and left her alone on the observation deck, Ziral remained motionless. For a long time, her analytical mind tried to process what had happened, but for the first time in her life, logic felt insufficient. She touched her face where his fingers had been, and wondered why her neural dampeners felt suddenly foreign against her skin. In the distance, warning lights began to flash. Long-range sensors had detected Vrex battlecruisers moving toward the Kepler colony. The real test was about to begin. The klaxons wailed through the diplomatic station as Ziral ran through corridors filled with controlled chaos. Human efficiency, she was learning, looked nothing like Kethmori precision. where her people would have moved in silent, calculated formation. Humans shouted orders, checked on one another, moved with purpose tempered by concern for their colleagues. She found Commander Thorne in the tactical center, his hands dancing across holographic displays as he coordinated the station's defenses. The Vrex fleet had arrived 6 hours ahead of schedule, their attack on Kepler Colony serving as a brutal opening move in what was clearly a larger conflict. "Status report," Kai commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "Kepler's shields are holding but barely." Lieutenant Torres responded, her face pale but determined. "They've got maybe 40 minutes before the Vrex breakthrough. Our reinforcement fleet is still 3 hours out." Zyril watched Kai's face as he processed the information. She expected to see the emotional turmoil that humans seemed prone to. Fear, anger, despair. Instead, she witnessed something far more complex. His emotions were there, burning bright, but they seemed to fuel his tactical brilliance rather than cloud it. "We go in," he decided. "Full escort formation. We can't hold them off alone, but we can buy time." "Sir, with respect, this station isn't equipped for direct combat." "Then we make it equipped." Kai's gaze swept across his people, and Zyril saw something she'd never witnessed before. The way a leader's conviction could transform doubt into determination through sheer force of will. Every life down there matters. Every child, every parent, every person who chose to build something instead of destroy it. That's what we're fighting for. The station shuddered as it changed course, heading directly into a battle they couldn't win. Zyril found herself assigned to auxiliary damage control, a precaution she was told since her analytical abilities might prove useful. She suspected Kai had arranged it to keep her away from the worst of the fighting, and the realization created another unfamiliar sensation in her chest. Concern. He was concerned for her welfare. The battle began 12 minutes later. Through the tactical displays, Zyril watched human vessels, outnumbered 3-1, throw themselves against the Vrex fleet with what appeared to be reckless abandon. But as she studied their movements, she began to see the pattern. Each seemingly desperate attack was precisely calculated to draw fire away from the colony. Each sacrificial maneuver was designed to create openings for their allies. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to save lives. The station rocked under enemy fire, and Zyril felt something she'd never experienced. Genuine fear. Not for herself, but for the humans around her. For Kai, wherever he was in this metal labyrinth, making impossible decisions with lives hanging in the balance. Dr. Vexithani. Lieutenant Torres appeared beside her, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead. "We need you in Section C7. Structural damage has trapped a repair team." They ran through corridors filled with smoke and the acrid smell of overloaded circuits. Section C7 was a maze of twisted metal and sparking conduits, and somewhere in the wreckage, 3 humans were trapped. "Here," Torres shouted, pointing to a gap barely wide enough for a person. "The passage is too unstable for anyone in full gear, but you're smaller." "I am not trained for rescue operations," Zyril protested, even as she found herself moving toward the gap. "Neither were they," Torres replied, nodding toward the trapped engineers. "But they went in anyway because people needed help." The rescue took 27 minutes. 27 minutes of crawling through unstable debris, of calculating stress loads and structural integrity while 3 humans with broken bones and failing air supplies trusted her completely. When she finally emerged with the last injured engineer, Torres grabbed her in what humans called a hug. An embrace that should have felt inefficient and inappropriate. Instead, it felt like coming home. "You did good, Doc," Torres whispered. "You did real good." Later, as medical teams treated the wounded, Zyril found herself in one of the station's emergency shelters. The tactical displays showed the battle continuing to rage, human ships still buying precious time with their lives. She was examining her torn uniform when Kai appeared in the doorway. "I heard you pulled 3 people out of a collapsed section," he said, moving to sit beside her on the emergency bench. "It was logical," she replied, though the word felt hollow. "They possessed valuable technical knowledge." Zyril. The way he said her name, dropping her formal title, made her look up. His face was streaked with soot, his uniform torn, but his eyes held that same intensity that had captivated her from their first meeting. You risked your life for strangers. That's not logic. That's something else entirely. She stared at him, feeling something crack further inside her chest. What is it then? Instead of answering with words, he reached up and gently touched her neural dampeners. May I? She should have said no. The dampeners were essential, the foundation of everything she was. But something in his eyes made her nod. His fingers were gentle as he deactivated the devices. The change was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, she could feel everything. The fear she'd been suppressing, the concern for the humans around her, the strange pull she felt whenever Kai was near. Oh, she breathed. Tears she didn't understand streaming down her face. Oh, this is what you feel all the time. All of it, he confirmed, his own eyes suspiciously bright. The fear, the joy, the connection to something bigger than ourselves. It's terrifying, she whispered. Yes, he agreed, moving closer. It is. But also, she struggled for words in a language that suddenly seemed inadequate. Beautiful. Overwhelming. Like a fire inside. Now you understand, he said softly, his hand cupping her face. This is why we burn so hot. Because feeling everything, even the pain, means we're truly alive. When he kissed her, it was like being struck by lightning. Every suppressed sensation, every emotion she'd never allowed herself to experience, crashed over her in a wave of intensity that made her previous existence seem like a pale shadow. She kissed him back with desperate hunger, her hands tangling in his hair, her body pressing against his as if trying to absorb some of his human fire. He tasted like coffee and determination, like the salt of tears and the copper of courage. Zyril, he murmured against her lips, and her name had never sounded like that before, like a prayer, like a promise. I understand now, she whispered back, her voice breaking with the weight of emotion. I understand why you fight, why you sacrifice, why you refuse to abandon the innocent. And she looked into his eyes, seeing her own transformation reflected there. And I can never go back to the cold. The station shuddered again, reminding them both that the battle still raged. But something fundamental had changed. Zyril was no longer just an observer. She had stepped into the flame, and it had transformed her completely. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of emergency repairs, tactical planning, and the gradual realization that the Vrex weren't going to be satisfied with just Kepler Colony. Long-range sensors showed additional battle groups moving toward 3 other human settlements, and intelligence suggested this was only the beginning of a coordinated campaign. Zyril worked alongside the human crew without her neural dampeners, every moment a revelation of sensation and feeling. She experienced frustration when circuits wouldn't respond properly, satisfaction when repairs held under stress, and a fierce protectiveness toward the humans she'd come to think of as friends. The word felt strange in her mind. Kethmori didn't have friends. They had colleagues, collaborators, functionally compatible associates. But what she felt for Lieutenant Torres, for Chief Engineer Valdez, for the medical team that had trusted her completely during the crisis, it was something far more personal. And what she felt for Kai was something else entirely. She found him in his quarters during a brief respite, studying tactical displays that painted an increasingly grim picture. Without her dampeners, she could see the weight he carried, not just the responsibility for the station and its crew, but for every human life under threat. The Vrex are moving faster than our intelligence predicted, he said without looking up. We've got maybe 12 hours before they hit Proxima Station. Can we stop them? Not with what we have. He finally turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her newly awakened heart clench with fear. But we can make, them pay for it. She moved closer, drawn by an instinct she was still learning to trust. What aren't you telling me? His smile was sad and beautiful and terrible. Smart woman. Always were too smart for your own good. He stood, closing the distance between them. The reinforcement fleet is coming, but there's still 36 hours. Out, someone needs to buy them time. Someone, she repeated, understanding flooding through her. You mean you. I mean us. The crew. This station. His hands found her face, and she leaned into the touch that had become as necessary as breathing. We're going to take this diplomatic station and turn her into the biggest, most ornery fighting ship the Vrex have ever seen. The tactical plan was audacious to the point of madness. The diplomatic station would position itself between the Vrex fleet and Proxima Station, using its upgraded shields and hastily mounted weapons to hold the line. It was, by any logical analysis, a suicide mission. It was also, Cyril realized, the most human thing she'd ever witnessed. You're going to get yourselves killed, she said, though she already knew it wouldn't change anything. Maybe, Kai admitted, but maybe not. And even if we do, we'll have saved 60,000 lives at Proxima. 60,000 strangers. 60,000 people, he corrected gently. Mothers and fathers and children and grandparents and dreamers and builders and everyone who makes life worth living. That night, as the station prepared for what might be its final battle, Cyril found herself in Kai's quarters again. This time, there was no pretense of tactical planning or casual conversation. They both knew what tomorrow might bring. I need to tell you something, she said, sitting on the edge of his bed while he secured the last of his equipment. I'm listening. I've been sending reports to my people about human behavior, about your tactical decisions, about... She gestured helplessly. About everything. He nodded, unsurprised. I figured. It's your job. The last report I sent was different. She looked up at him. This human who had changed everything about her existence. I told them they were wrong. About emotions being weakness. About efficiency being the highest virtue. And they want me to return immediately for recalibration. The word tasted bitter. They consider me compromised. Kai sat beside her, his presence a warm anchor in the storm of her emotions. Are you? Compromised? She considered the question seriously. By Kethamori standards, she was utterly compromised. She made decisions based on feelings, rather than pure logic. She cared about outcomes not because they were optimal, but because they were right. She had risked her life to save strangers not because they were valuable assets, but because they were people. Yes, she said finally. Completely. Good, he said, and kissed her. This time there was no hesitation, no careful exploration. They came together with the desperate hunger of two people who might not have tomorrow, their bodies speaking a language older than words or logic. His hands traced the silver patterns that decorated her skin, markings that had once been merely cultural identifiers, but now seemed to burn under his touch. She learned the geography of his scars, each one a story of sacrifice and survival. The puckered flesh on his shoulder from shrapnel at Meridian Station, the thin line across his ribs from a Vrex blade that had come too close, the small marks on his hands from 100 minor injuries sustained while protecting others. Beautiful, she whispered, tracing the silver threading in his hair. You're so beautiful when you burn. So are you, he replied, his voice rough with emotion and desire. God, Cyril, you're like a star coming to life. They made love with the intensity of people who had finally found something worth living for, worth dying for. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a declaration of war against the cold logic that had once defined her existence. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the dim light of his quarters, Cyril felt something she'd never experienced before. Complete peace. Not the artificial equilibrium of her neural dampeners, but the deep contentment of being exactly where she belonged. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said softly, I want you to know that you saved me. No, Kai replied, his arms tightening around her. We saved each other. The battle began at 0400 hours ship time. Cyril had never experienced combat from the inside before. Through her dampened existence, she'd observed conflicts with clinical detachment, analyzing tactics and outcomes with no personal investment. Now strapped into a crash seat in the tactical center, she felt every hit the station took like a personal wound. The wrecks came in 3 waves, their chitinous vessels spitting plasma fire and magnetic torpedoes. The diplomatic station, never designed for this kind of punishment, shuddered and sparked and held the line anyway. She watched Kai orchestrate the defense like a conductor leading a symphony of controlled violence. Every order was precise, every decision calculated to maximize their defensive effectiveness while minimizing casualties. But beneath the tactical brilliance, she could see the emotional foundation that drove every choice, the absolute refusal to let innocent people die on his watch. "Starboard shields at 30%, Torres reported, her voice steady despite the blood running from a gash on her forehead. "Reroute power from non-essential systems," Kai ordered, "and prepare the dorsal torpedo tubes." "Sir, we only have 4 torpedoes left. Then we make them count." The third wave hit them like a hammer blow. Zyril felt the station's superstructure groan under the assault, felt the artificial gravity fluctuate as power systems strained beyond their limits. But still, they held the line. Then she saw it on the tactical display, a massive Rex dreadnought, twice the size of anything they'd faced, moving directly toward their position. "Everyone hold fast," Kai commanded, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "We've got this." But Zyril could see what he couldn't: the trajectory calculations, the power distribution readings, the structural integrity reports. The dreadnoughts' main guns were charging, and when they fired, the diplomatic station wouldn't survive. Unless someone did something impossibly brave and utterly foolish. "Kai," she said, standing from her crash seat. He turned, and in that moment she saw him truly see her. Not the cold observer she'd been, not the analytical alien studying human behavior, but the woman who had stepped into the fire and chosen to burn. "I love you," she said simply. Before he could respond, the dreadnought fired, and Commander Kai Thorne threw himself across the tactical center to shield her from the explosion that tore through the station's hull. The medical bay's antiseptic lighting cast harsh shadows across Kai's still form, making him look younger and more vulnerable than Zyril had ever seen him. The medical readouts painted a sobering picture: severe internal injuries, neural trauma. From the blast, his body fighting a battle against overwhelming damage, but he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. "The neural pathways are showing improvement," Dr. Chen reported, though her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been working miracles for 3 straight days. "The cellular regeneration therapy is taking hold, but his recovery will be extensive." Zyril nodded, not trusting her voice. She hadn't left his side since they'd pulled him from the wreckage of the tactical center. Hadn't slept, barely eaten. The other survivors had tried to convince her to rest, but the thought of being anywhere else was inconceivable. The battle had ended in victory, though the cost had been severe. The diplomatic station was a gutted wreck, held together by emergency bulkheads and sheer determination. 37 crew members had died holding the line, including Lieutenant Torres, who had kept the shields operational until the very last moment. But Proxima Station had survived. 60,000 people were alive because a few hundred humans had decided that some things were worth dying for. "Dr. Vexithani?" The voice belonged to Admiral Reeves, the senior commander who had arrived with the reinforcement fleet. "May I have a word?" Zyril looked up, reluctant to leave Kai's side even for a moment. The Admiral's expression was kind but serious, never a good combination in her experience. "Your people have been in contact," he said once they were in the corridor. "The Kethmori Collective is concerned about your extended absence from scheduled reports." "I'm sure they are." She kept her voice neutral, though inside she felt the familiar fire that had replaced her cold logic. "What do they want?" "They're sending a ship, a medical vessel officially, to provide advanced treatment for Commander Thorne." The Admiral's pause was telling. "Unofficially, they want to bring you home for what they term psychological recalibration." The words hit her like a physical blow. Recalibration meant the complete suppression of everything she had become: the emotions, the connections, the love that had transformed her from a cold observer into a living, feeling being. They would restore her neural dampeners, adjust her brain chemistry, and ensure she returned to the sterile efficiency of her previous existence. And if I refuse, then you'll be considered a rogue agent, permanently exiled from Kethmori space. Admiral Reeves studied her carefully. I have to ask Dr. Vexthani, is Commander Thorne worth losing everything you've ever known? The question should have been difficult. By any logical calculation, she was being asked to sacrifice her career, her people, her entire identity for one human male. The rational choice was obvious, but logic had never felt less relevant. Admiral, she said quietly, 3 days ago Kai threw himself into an explosion to protect me. He didn't calculate the odds or consider the strategic implications. He just acted, because that's what humans do when they love someone. She looked back toward the medical bay. How could I do anything less? The Kethmori medical vessel arrived, 6 hours later. Zyril stood in the docking bay as the pristine white ship settled into its berth, its lines as clean and emotionless as everything her people created. Through the transparent aluminum viewports, she could see her former colleagues, beings she had once considered friends, though she now understood the limitation of that word as she had used it then. Dr. Vorthak emerged first, his silver and blue, skin unmarked by emotion, his movements precise and calculated. Behind him came 2 medical technicians and a figure that made Zyril's newly awakened heart skip, Commander Zethel, her former mentor and the closest thing to family she had ever known. Zyril, Vorthak said, inclining his head in the traditional greeting. You appear altered. She could see herself through his eyes, her previously pristine appearance now marked by sleepless nights and emotional strain. Her neural dampeners still in her pocket would be conspicuous by their absence. To Kethmori sensibilities she looked damaged, corrupted. To her own eyes, she looked alive. I've learned things, she replied simply. So we have observed from your reports. Commander Zethel stepped forward, and Zyril was startled to see something almost like concern in his usually impassive features. Child, what have these humans done to you? They've shown me what it means to truly live. This is precisely the kind of psychological contamination we feared, Vorthak interjected. Emotional reasoning, attachment to inferior species, abandonment of rational thought processes. The recalibration chambers are prepared. We can have you restored to optimal function within 48 hours. And if I choose not to be restored? The silence that followed her question was telling. Finally, Zethel spoke. Then you will be lost to us forever. Is this human male truly worth such a sacrifice? Before she could answer, the medical bay doors opened and Dr. Chen emerged, her face bright with the kind of joy that Zyril now understood came from witnessing a miracle. Dr. Vexthani, she called out, ignoring the Kethmori delegation entirely. He's awake, and he's asking for you. Zyril looked at her people, the representatives of everything she had once been, the cold perfection she could return to with a simple choice. Then she looked toward the medical bay where a human who had risked everything for her was waiting. Watch, she said to Vorthak and Zethel. Watch and learn what your perfect logic cannot teach you. She walked away from them, toward the fire that had become her life. Kai was propped up in the medical bed looking pale but alert. When he saw her, his face transformed with that smile that had first begun to crack her emotional barriers. Hey, beautiful, he said, his voice rough but warm. Did we win? We won, she confirmed, taking his hand in hers. The gesture felt as natural as breathing. Proxima Station is safe, the Vrex are retreating. Good. He squeezed her fingers gently. Was it worth it? She thought about the question, not just about the battle, but about everything that had led them to this moment. The pain of losing her old identity, the terror of feeling everything, the overwhelming joy of connection and love. Every moment, she said firmly, every choice, every risk, every second of pain, it was all worth it. Behind her, she heard Vorthak make a sound of disgust. Emotional contamination, completely irrational. Kai's eyes sharpened, focusing on the Kethmori delegation. Friends of yours? Former colleagues, Zyril replied. They've come to take me home for recalibration. Ah. Kai's grip on her hand tightened slightly. And your decision? She turned to face her people, drawing strength from Kai's presence behind her. Commander Zethel, you asked if one human male was worth losing everything I've ever known. Her former mentor nodded stiffly. You're asking the wrong question, she continued. The question isn't whether he's worth losing my old life. The question is whether my old life was worth living at all. She thought of Lieutenant Torres dying at her post to save strangers, of Chief Valdez, working around the clock to keep the shields operational, of every human who had risked everything for people. They'd never met simply because it was right. I've seen what it means to burn with passion, she said, her voice growing stronger. I've felt what it's like to love someone more than my own existence. I've experienced the terror and the joy and the overwhelming beauty of being truly, completely alive. She looked at Kai, then back at her people. And I choose the fire. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Zethel nodded slowly, a gesture of acceptance, if not understanding. Then you are lost to us, he said simply. No, Zyril replied, moving to stand beside Kai's bed, their hands intertwined. I was lost before. Now I'm found. 6 months later, Zyril stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Kepler station, watching the stars with eyes that had learned to see beauty as well as data. Her work as a cultural liaison between humanity and various species had proven invaluable. Her unique perspective as someone who had bridged the gap between logic and emotion made her the perfect translator for others struggling to understand human behavior. Kai joined her, his recovery complete, his arms encircling her from behind. She leaned into his warmth, still marveling at the simple miracle of his presence. Any regrets? He asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. She considered the question seriously. She had lost her people, her culture, her entire previous identity. By any logical measure, she had sacrificed everything. None, she said firmly. You taught me that the things worth living for are worth feeling for. And this. She gestured to encompass not just their relationship, but the bustling station around them, the humans and aliens working together, the children playing in the gardens they had helped design. This is worth everything. He kissed her temple, and she felt the familiar fire spread through her chest, not the destructive heat of battle, but the warm glow of a love that had transformed her completely. She had stepped into the human flame and emerged as something new. Not Kethmori, not human, but something uniquely her own. A being who had chosen passion over perfection, love over logic, the beautiful chaos of feeling over the sterile peace of emotional void. And she burned brighter than she had ever imagined possible. In the depths of space, other species watched and wondered at the strange partnership between the passionate humans and their unlikely allies. Some called it contamination, others called it evolution. Zyril called it coming home.